Well, it's great to have each one of you here today. And if you are here in Oklahoma City, then it is Palm Sunday, and it's a beautiful, beautiful day. And the Lord is good, and Jesus deserves all the praise. Luke chapter 19 is where we're going to go today. Luke chapter 19. And I want to call your attention to verse 28 and following. If you've got a handout, the scripture should be on that handout. However, if you don't have a handout, if you'd like to look it up in a Bible, right there in front of you should be one in your songbook rack. Luke 19, and we'll start reading with verse 28. After Jesus had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. Jesus is, I'll just stop and explain the context just a little bit. Jesus has been working his way back toward Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the capital city of Israel. It's where the political center, it's the center of power, the center of the economy in the Jewish world. And he's been working his way gradually back toward Jerusalem, and he's still going that way. Now, since the early part of a few verses before this, he's been telling his disciples that he is headed up to Jerusalem and that he's going to be put to death. He's been predicting his own death and his own resurrection. Now, some people might predict their own death, but not very many people predict their own resurrection. We could stop there for a while, but we're going to keep going, all right? Luke 19, he was going on up to Jerusalem. And as he approached Bethphage and Bethany at the hill called Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, a colt of a donkey, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it, and bring it here. And if anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?'" And by the way, if you saw somebody getting in your car and starting it up, you'd ask too, wouldn't you? "Excuse me, what are you doing?" Yeah. If you see anyone asks you, "Why are you untying it?" say, "The Lord needs it." Now that one won't work if somebody's getting in your car and starting it, but in this case, he says, just tell them the Lord needs it. Those who were sent ahead went and found it just as he had told them. And as they were untying the colt, its owners asked them, "Why are you untying the colt?" And they replied, "The Lord needs it." And they let him go. Verse 35, they brought it to Jesus. And they threw their cloaks on the colt and put Jesus on it. As he went along, people spread their cloaks on the road. Now, I want to stop and say they put their cloaks on a colt of a donkey. Nobody really, in our world, nobody really processes this. But if you are a king coming to conquer, nobody rides on the colt of a donkey. Okay, you know, how many people have ever ridden a horse? You've ridden a horse? Let me see your hands. Have you ridden horses? Okay, you've ridden horses. You feel that sense of sometimes of being very small when you've ridden a horse. You feel this sense of being very small in respect to the powerful animal that's underneath you, right? I will never forget riding a horse when I was a kid. I was probably 12 years old, something like that, and some friends of ours at a city we were visiting at a town out in the country, they had some horses, and they said, "We want you to go with us." And they put me on a horse, and this horse, they said, "Don't put him on whatever the one horse's name was." They said, "That horse is just old and lazy, just kind of walks along." Said, "Put him on," I think it was Christy was the name of the horse. No offense, Christy 5, but anyway. So I got up on the horse, and the horse just kind of looked back at me and kind of adjusted to the feel of me being on his back, and then hit on her back, I probably should say. So as we were going along a little ways, suddenly, all of a sudden, the horse decided he didn't like, I'm not sure what I was doing, honestly, but he decided he didn't like something I was doing, and kind of skittered and went sideways like that, and I'm all of a sudden, you feel kind of small, like I'm not sure I'm in control of this situation. But if you're on a colt of a donkey, just the young one, right? Just the small one, this is a donkey, Now they're stubborn, But it's just the colt. It's not like you're suddenly going to rear up and, No, it's just the colt of a donkey. Jesus comes riding on the colt of a donkey, meaning that he is bringing, in those days, they saw it as a sign he was bringing peace. He was not bringing war, he was bringing peace. And the Jews had had enough of war. We'll talk about that a little more as we go. As he went along, people spread their cloaks on the road. Anybody ever seen the red carpet treatment? In these days, this was the red carpet treatment. Oh, so the person coming is so important. They're so valuable. They're so honored. We don't even want the hooves of their animal to touch the common ground that everybody else rides on. We're going to spread out the cloaks on the road. So they take off their outer cloak that they would wrap up in when it was cold and spread it out, running ahead of him, spreading the red carpet treatment for Jesus. And when they came near the place where the road goes down the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began to joyfully praise God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest. Now, this seems, maybe if you don't know everything we know, maybe this seems a little bit out of place. Okay, why now? Why he's riding on a donkey coming down a hill on his way back up to Jerusalem? Why now? Why aren't you always praising like this? Why aren't you always shouting? Well, there's some background here that you might not know, and you'd find that in the book of Zechariah. The book of Zechariah, chapter 9. In fact, I'm going to grab my Bible real quickly. The book of Zechariah, it's in the Old Testament. It's one of the prophets. In the book of Zechariah, chapter 9, there's a very interesting verse. It's in a section of the Bible where it talks about the judgment that's going to fall on the enemies of Israel. Okay, so Jesus is a Jew. He's in the country of Israel, and in a section that says God is going to bring down judgment on the enemies of God's people. And in a section right there, we have this verse in Zechariah chapter 9, verse number 9. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Zion was God's people, the Jerusalem, the city where God's people dwell. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king is coming to you, righteous and victorious, humble, lowly, and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Whoa. This was prophesied a long time before Jesus ever showed up. This is one of those things. That would argue for Jesus being who he says he is. That he fulfilled prophecies that were written a long time before. Now, some people could look at this and say, well, he engineered that. He engineered this. Like he was like, okay, first I'm going to come back to Jerusalem, and then I've got to find a donkey. Yeah. But no, that's not what's going on here. Now, Jesus knew all these things. He knew the prophecy. He knew that there was a donkey. He knew how to get a hold of it. He knew that if he wrote it, he was going to be fulfilling this prophecy. But it wasn't to fool the people. It was because he was exactly who he claimed to be. So see, your king comes to you, righteous, victorious, humble, riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And the next verse, verse 10 says, and I will take away the chariots from Ephraim, and the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow will be broken, and he will proclaim peace to the nations, and his rule will extend from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. Wow. hey, Jesus is coming, and he's going to cause wars to cease. He's going to break the bow. He's going to proclaim peace to the nations. All the people of the world are going to be ruled over by this king riding on this donkey. You might see why they might get excited. In fact, let me go one step further. You'd get excited too if you were in the context and you saw what was going on in the Jewish world in these days. You see, Jews were not free. They were not free. They were under the thumb of Roman rule. The Roman dictatorship, and from Rome came down the orders, and everybody had to follow. Rome ruled with an iron fist over all of the ancient world. In fact, there were laws on the books that if a Roman soldier who was an officer serving in the army saw you walking down the street and he was carrying a heavy load, his shopping bags for the day, or his load he had to carry back to his home, and he saw you and he said, "Here, you carry my load," you had to carry it for a mile. And this is why Jesus, you ever heard going the extra mile? You ever heard that phrase? It's Jesus who said, if someone commands you to carry their load for a mile, carry it too. That's where that came from. Because in those days, they could just randomly, it didn't matter that Rodney had a family to go home to and that he was on his way to work, didn't matter. You had to carry their load for a mile. Didn't matter. Didn't matter what you had to do for that day. Sorry, you got to carry the load for a mile. That's not very cool. Like you had to pay taxes, and it didn't matter what the taxes all went to wars. Rome and their expansion all across the world, making more armies and creating more weapons and more. Anybody been to a political rally recently? Anybody want to admit it? All right. Yeah, okay. All right. In the last year, we've been through an election, and my goodness, right? Everything happens. The people, and they stand up and they say, "Vote for me, I'll set you free," right? You don't like what they're doing with your tax dollars. You don't like the way, you're not as free as you could be. Vote for me, I'll set you free, right? That's the basic idea. And plus, I'm going to make all those other guys, I'm going to make them pay. Whether it's the enemy, everybody's got to have an enemy, right? And so whether the enemy is the rich people or the poor people or the black people or the brown people or the white people or the people overseas that wear turbans on their heads, right? No matter who the enemy is, everybody paints somebody as the enemy. And if you'll vote for me, I'll give you justice. We're going to make America something again, right? Now I'm not here to get political. I'm just here to say that we're not the first people that got political, right? These people saw Jesus coming, and their first thought was politics. Their first thought was victory, justice, lower taxes. Nobody's telling me to carry a load anymore. I'll tell them what for. You don't know the king. My king, he's a humble king, but he's righteous, and he lives, and his rule is going to reign from sea to sea and from the river all the way to the ends of the earth. And you just don't, you don't know who I am. Right. That's the first thing they think. And so you might see, if you've ever seen a political rally and you've seen the people jumping up and down and waving the signs and chanting the slogans, then you know what this was. That's exactly what's going on here in Luke chapter 19. Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." "I tell you," he said, "if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out." And by the way, not everybody in this crowd was sincere in their praise, but Jesus did deserve it. And he didn't shut them up because he did deserve the honor, and he did deserve the glory. And it was a high day. The king was coming. All of the earth had longed for this king to show up, and here comes the king. As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you, encircle you, and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. Wow. And you know what? It happened in 70 A.D. Jesus died in 33, approximately, right in there. And in 70 A.D., the Roman general Titus came to put down a Jewish rebellion. And when they set fire to the temple, Herod's temple that he had built, the fire was so hot it melted the gold, and the gold ran down the outside of the temple and ran between the huge stones. And when it ran between the huge stones, they literally tore every stone off of the top of the other to peel the melted gold after it cooled, to peel it out from between the rocks. Literally every single stone in the temple was thrown down. Because you did not recognize the time of God's coming. And when Jesus entered the temple courts, he began to drive out those who were selling. As it is written, he said to them, "My house will be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." And every day he was teaching at the temple, but the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the leaders among the people were trying to kill him, yet they could not find any way to do it because the people hung on his words. Today I want to talk to you about the story God is telling in your life and how you fit into it. Donald Miller is a New York Times best-selling author. He's written several books, Blue Like Jazz and A Million Miles in 1,000 Years, and several other books. He says every story is the same. He said there are only a few stories in the world, and every story is basically the same. He says every story has these parts. Desire, a character wants something. I'm going to go back over these in a moment, but I'm going to roll through them real quick. Okay? Desire, a character wants something, but they have a problem. So a guide comes into the story, gives them a plan, they have to follow the plan, and it ends in either success or failure. And that's the only story that exists in the world. That story is happening over and over and over again in some kind of way. Every story is that way. And if you think back about it, and you look back at movies you've seen and books that you've read, you'll see that's pretty much true. That same kind of pattern happens all the time. Now I want to go through it, and I want to talk to you about it in the context of this story, the Palm Sunday story. First of all, a character wants something. Desire. A character in the story wants something. Now, what the character wants in most stories could be anything. It could be a championship, right? If it's Remember the Titans or Hoosiers, or it may be a wonderful relationship if it's Sleepless in Seattle or practically every chick flick ever. It may be a job, a good job, a better job. It may be meaning and purpose. It may be freedom. It may be not to be bullied. It could be wealth. It could be all kinds of different things. A character in the story wants something to happen. These guys in this story, these people wanted something too. They wanted freedom. They wanted political power. They wanted clout. They wanted the ability to not have to listen to what Rome said any longer and not to be under the iron fist of the Roman Empire. And I will tell you that in your story, you want something too. Right? In almost everybody wants something. Everybody wants to do something. Everybody wants something out of your story. Blaise Pascal, the great French philosopher and scientist, said this. He said, "All men desire pleasure. All men want pleasure and joy." He said they want joy, and this is the goal of every single man, even those who kill themselves. That everybody wants joy. Everybody. Now you can disagree or agree with that, but everybody wants something. And I think that in your story, you want something too. Now I don't know, I may not know what it is, you may not know what it is, but you want something in your story. The problem is there's another part of every story, resistance. They have a problem. They've got a problem. They got a problem. There's something that pushes back against it. They don't have a job, or there's another team, or there's a bigger school, or there's another army, there's a general, there's an evil king. Something keeps them from having what they want. There's resistance in the story. Now, in most stories, there's an external problem, and the external problem, I don't know if you can read that or not. Those are kind of small fonts. The external problem usually reveals the internal problem, the one in here. The problem out there usually reveals a problem in here. If you think about it, the Hickory Huskers, they wanted a championship. The Titans wanted a championship, but it wasn't just the external problem of a bigger school and another. There was an internal problem, maybe of lack of discipline and racism, and there's an internal problem that gets revealed by the external problem, right? Sometimes they want to conquer the bad guy, but the internal problem is they're afraid. Sometimes they want to have a wonderful relationship, but the internal problem is they're selfish. Right? And they've got to deal with the external problem reveals an internal problem. Now, in this story, the external problem is Rome. It's the bad government. It's the evil king. He's up there, and he's telling us what he's going to do. That's the external problem. But in the internal, in their hearts, the problem was that they would do anything, regardless of whether it was God's will or not. They do anything just to have their own way. Now, if you don't believe that, you got to see what happened next, right? Because right after this, Jesus comes into the city, and then he doesn't announce himself as the Messiah. He just sits at the temple, teaches for a while, tells a few stories, and then goes to bed. He actually goes back outside the city and goes to Bethany, a little suburb of Jerusalem, for the night. And everybody's like, yay, yay, rah, 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 rah. You can almost hear the sad trombone, right? Wah, 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 wah. And they're like, but I thought that, but what? I thought that he was going to. Anybody ever felt this in your life? You're like, yeah, God's going to do this, God's going to do that, and wait a minute, God? I thought that you were going to. Did you not hear my prayer? Did you not get my 5-point plan? If you have not had that experience yet, you will. Your turn's coming. We've all been there. I thought this was going to be... You see, the external problem in your life sometimes is only a thing that reveals the internal problem, what's really going on. You see, it was not that long afterwards that this same crowd, some of the ones in this same crowd were shouting, "Crucify him, put him to death." And Pilate lifts up a man named Barabbas, a notorious murderer and rioter, a guy who led riots and said, "Let's fight back. We're going to fight back against Rome and the tyranny. We're not going to stand for it. Let's kill them all." And he held Barabbas up next to Jesus and said, "How about shall I release to you Jesus or Barabbas?" And they said, "Release Barabbas." You know why? Because the external problem wasn't the real problem. The problem was they were willing to do anything to get their own way, and they thought Jesus was a king coming to do what they wanted. The resistance. You know the resistance? You ever felt it? You ever felt it where you become a Christian and you're starting to follow Jesus and you really do believe in Him and you're praying and you're seeking God, and then there's a problem that comes into your life and your heart goes, "Ugh." right? I thought this was supposed to be done with. I didn't think this road was going to be so hard. I thought following Jesus meant He fixed it. I thought He put my everything back together, and He fixed my job, and He fixed my relationships, and He fixed everything, and I don't feel fixed. Well, maybe what's happening right now in that moment, maybe what's happening is this. Maybe what's happening is wisdom. You see, a guide enters the story. When they can't solve it themselves, the team can't win the championship, the guy can't get the job, the girl can't get the guy can't get the girl, the man can't beat the monster. When that happens, in steps a guide into the story. Now maybe you've been looking to yourself as a guide. Or maybe you've been looking to the world around you as a guide. Or maybe you've been looking to some book you've been reading as a guide. Or maybe you've been looking to, your guide to make it go better. Help me be able to deal with it. Maybe you've been looking to drugs, alcohol, sex, sin, lies, anything but God. But I want to tell you that Jesus, as the King, wants to ride into your life and say, I'm here to bring peace. If you'll listen to me, right? Wisdom. There's another part to stories, change. The guide gives them a plan. You know this in stories, you know this, right? The coach tries a new plan. The coach says, we're going to practice this way. We're going to do it my way. And somebody resists, and somebody pushes back, and the coach says, no, we're doing it my way. You know, there's conflict over the plan. Change happens. Everybody say change. Everybody say change is hard. It is hard, isn't it? It is difficult. It's uncomfortable. We don't like it. And we come to Jesus thinking that He's come, if you come to Jesus thinking that He has come to do what you want, we have a problem. You've got the relationship backwards. You've got it upside down. You've got that organizational chart where you're at the top and everything else, and Jesus is down here in the part below. You've got it upside down. Jesus is up here, and you're the one down at the bottom, down here. Right. So, change is hard. And then comes the time that, the next part in the story is action. Action. They have to choose to act on the plan. Sometimes they have to choose to act on the plan when they can't see the end. When they can't see how it's going to go. When they don't know. It's easy to play the story in reverse, in rewind, when you can see what's going to happen and you know they're going to win, but in the middle of the story, it's hard, especially if you're in it. My kids, they crack me up when if we're gonna watch something, and we're gonna watch Chronicles of Narnia, I think was the last time that this happened. We were gonna watch the Chronicles of Narnia, and I've got a couple of kids that can't. I know the story, and I also know how stories go, and I know that it ends up okay. How many know what I'm talking about? It ends up all right at the end. But when you're in the story, they deliberately make it feel like and look like it's not going to be okay, right? And you get that sweat on your palms, and you get, so Caleb, one of my sons, will suddenly just jump up and leave the room. Just like, boom, and he's gone. And you go in there and say, Caleb, come here, buddy. I want you. No, it's okay. I don't. And I know what it is, right? I know what it is. That he's feeling worried about whether or not they're going to make it. Because he can't separate out and say, logically, I know this is going to be okay. You know why? Because he feels like he's in the story. And when you're in the middle of your story, You forget all those ones you've seen where it turns out okay. You forget all these ones right here where you've read and it turned out all right. And Daniel made it through the lion's den, and the Hebrew boys were delivered from the fiery furnace. And that you forget all these stories, all you can think about is yours, and you want to get up and run out of the room. Because you don't want to deal with the fact that God says, now it's time for you to work the plan. It's your story, and it's hard. It's hard when you're in it with your marriage. It's hard when you're in it with in the disagreement, or you're in counseling and you're working through it. It's hard when you're trying to get your kids back. It's hard when you're trying to work your way up the job. It's hard when the relationships with your boss or in your apartment is going bad and it's going south, and you're like, oh, it's hard to act on the plan. Anybody ever heard Jesus say, love your enemies? That's hard. Anybody ever heard Jesus say, trust me? Right? That's hard. Anybody ever heard Jesus say, any husbands ever heard Jesus say, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her? That's hard. Any wives ever heard Jesus say, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as to the Lord? That's hard. Turn the other cheek? That's hard. Oh, it's hard. But Jesus comes with a plan. He has all the wisdom that you need. The question is whether you get up and run out of the room or whether you live through the middle of the story He's calling you to live through. Action. I love this cartoon right here. Calvin and Hobbes. Anybody love Calvin and Hobbes? I read Calvin and Hobbes. Bill Watterson's fantastic. Here's what happens. Calvin comes down the stairs and says, Dad, I want a bedtime story. And he says, I'm busy, Calvin. I can't do it tonight. And Calvin yells. He says, if you don't read me a story, I won't go to bed. And his dad comes up and sits down on the bed and says, once upon a time, there was a boy named Calvin who always wanted things his way. One day, his dad got sick of it and locked him in the basement the rest of his life, and everyone else lived happily ever after. The end. And walks out. And Calvin says to Hobbes, I don't like these stories with morals. Know that feeling? I want it my way right now. Why isn't it fixed yet? I've been serving God for 2 weeks. I've been to church 2 weeks in a row, and things are not better yet. You know what I'm saying? That feeling. Action. Now here's what I want to ask you. I want to tell you this. In almost every story, there is conflict between the main character and the guide at this point in the story. The mentor, the martial arts teacher, the coach, the whatever, there is conflict between the main character and the guide at this point in the story. Will they listen and follow the plan, or will they walk away and do things their own way? And so what I'm asking you is this today. Will you trust the guide even when it's hard? Oh, this is important. Will you trust the guide even when it is hard? Stories, thankfully, end with resolution. It either ends in success or it ends in failure, depending on whether or not the main character follows the guide, whether he follows the plan. This particular story is going to end in tragedy for those who worshiped Jesus that day. Not all of them, because some worshiped Him with sincere hearts. And when they said, Hosanna, which is a Hebrew word that means save us, when they said save us to Jesus, they were talking about whatever He wanted to do. You're the King, save us however you want. But some of the people were saying, Hosanna, save us the way we want to be saved. Save us with your politics, Jesus. Save us with your miracles. Save us by wiping out the external problem. And Jesus said, before we talk about the external problem of me ruling the world, we have to separate those two parts, and we have to deal with the internal problem of whether or not you will obey me. We have to deal with not first with the external problem of whether you will be free from the things that oppress you in your life. We have to start with the issue of whether you will follow me whatever I say. And that is a crucial decision in the story you're living right now. Because I already know this is true. That you make a turn and you say, I'm going to follow Jesus. And you're going to have conflict over this issue right here, whether or not you're going to act on His plan. Because the devil's going to come along and say, well, you could have just one. The devil's going to come along and say, well, this time you don't need to turn the other cheek. Right? The devil's going to come along and say, don't really have to love your enemies, you just have to win. The devil's going to come along and he'll say whatever he needs to say to try to draw you away into your own plan. And I just want to tell you this, that if you want it to end well, trust me when I tell you, the King of Kings has come riding into your life today. And He's riding humbly on a donkey. And there is a day coming where all will be okay. But He doesn't have to make it okay right now. It doesn't have to be okay. This moment doesn't have to be okay. He may be calling you to live through a hard moment in your story. He may be calling you to go through some changes that don't fix the external problem. They focus on the internal problem. And when He calls you to go through that, listen to Him and grow and take the time. Take the time. Be obedient. Follow His word, His will, and His way. Because if you'll do it, it'll end in the long term. It'll end in success. So here's what I have to do as we wrap it up today. I have to ask you, will you follow the King in whatever He calls you to today, this day, in this chapter in your story, in a hard time where He's called you to be alone for a period of time, in a hard time where He's called you to just work, and it's not cool, and it's not exciting, and it's not the job you wanted, and it's not the one you, and it's in a time where He's called you to just be going through the counseling, or going through the hard times, or going through the sorrow, in a time where He's called you to just do that. Is it okay with you? Can He do that? Will you make Him the King? Would you bow your heads with me for prayer?